Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'm going to begin a study of Aristotle's last book in the Organon, which is studied in Classical Reasoning 5 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And the title of this book, written by Aristotle, is Sophistical Elenchi, or Elenchi. Sophistical Elenchi. I'm not going to define what that phrase means, sophistical elenchi, because it's the subject of this whole study. And as I always tell students, dictionaries are helpful, but dictionaries are composed by men and are debatable. And what we always want to do is, whenever we read a source, especially an important source like Aristotle's philosophical writings, we want to let the author define his own terms, and we want to look in the works we're studying for the meanings of terms as they're used in context. So one of our focuses in this study will be answering the question, what are sophistical elenchi? And we'll quickly see that Aristotle provides us with a clear understanding of what that is, and then we'll study them in this book. So what I'd like to do in this first lesson is help students with their initial read through chapter 1 of book 1, provide a little bit of introductory information to help get the study started, and then walk along with students through this entire study as we work through Classical Reasoning 5 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. As far as a general introduction to this course, what I'd like to say is that what motivated Aristotle to study the art of reasoning was that in his experience in ancient Greece, it became apparent that men were going to be in great danger if they didn't learn the art and science of reasoning, because so much of human society and political life, which Aristotle calls the chief end of man, the common good, the good of the community, there would be so much harm done in cities and states and communities by men called sophists, that unless wise men, unless virtuous men figured out the art and science of reasoning, the sophists were going to run things. They were going to easily manipulate the common people. They were going to win elections. They were going to influence judges in courts. They were going to influence lawmakers in government. And the wise men, men like Aristotle, had to figure out the art and science of reasoning and teach it to the people so that the state or the community could be protected from the deceptive reasoning of the sophists. And this is what Aristotle seeks to do in his work on the Organon. And philosophers had started this work for, centuries before Aristotle. But the art of reasoning and the science of reasoning was never developed until Aristotle himself taught it and wrote of it in his Organon. We see, for example, in the generation before Aristotle, we see Socrates getting started with one kind of reasoning, but that's not sufficient. Socrates can point out through his reasoning, which we'll learn about in this opening book, Socrates can point out that there are contradictions in things said or thought by other men, but Socrates cannot positively establish the truth in a scientific manner, because the art of demonstrative reasoning at that time was not yet developed. Aristotle develops that in the first 4 books of the Organon, and then here in this last book, he deals with sophistical Elenchi, which have to do with the arguments of these sophists in society. Now, when many schools attempt to offer logic classes, in order to interest the students, what they'll do is they'll start by teaching what are called logical fallacies. But they haven't studied the art and science of reasoning yet, and they present the fallacies, giving students a false sense that they understand more of logic than they actually do. And one of the puzzling realities is that the people involved in modern classical education are actually examples of sophists, as we'll see as we study this work. And so it's a very confusing situation. Logical fallacies in Aristotle's reasoning come at the end of classical reasoning. They are not taught in the beginning. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that we shouldn't think that we are going to go out into the world and start proving everyone wrong and finding fallacies when we don't actually understand and have never yet studied the art and science of classical reasoning. And so rather than appear to know something and have an appearance of some logical expertise and talk about fallacies and things like that at the beginning of a logic class in a school, if we follow Aristotle's actual instruction, we'll see that these studies come last. And when we study them in the right order, in their right place, in the right way, we'll actually understand what those logical fallacies are. Because many who talk about them really, they don't understand what they are, and they actually misidentify them, oversimplify the situation, and as I said, just appear to have a wisdom that they don't actually have. So we want to avoid that, and by studying the entire body of Aristotle's science of reasoning, we'll be able to avoid that fake wisdom and have the real thing. So having said that, I think that's enough. Let's get started with this first chapter in the first book of Aristotle's Sophistical Elenchi. Let's read chapter 1 of book 1. Concerning sophistical Elenchi, and those things which appear indeed to be Elenchi, yet are not, but are paralogisms. Let us now speak, beginning, according to nature, from such things as are first. And just to help you get off to a good start here, Aristotle identifies the subject, that the subject of this book, as the title implies, will be sophistical Elenchi. And he says that he refers to those things which appear to be Elenchi but are not. And so we see that Elenchi can be true or can be apparent or false. Okay, so there's two different classes of Elenchi, and we're not trying to define this term yet. We're going to let the work that we read define it for us. But we see that there are different kinds of Elenchi, and that's obvious from the title, because if there are sophistical Elenchi, there must also be other Elenchi that are not sophistical. And he refers to paralogisms. And if we want to ask, what is he talking about here? What is he talking about? We have to go all the way back to the beginning of the very first chapter. The very first chapter of the categories. And you'll remember that in the first chapter, Aristotle talks about different kinds of terms. And he talks about homonymous terms, synonymous terms, and paronymous terms. And we learn that synonymous terms are terms that are used where in both contexts the meaning and the word are the same. Homonymous terms are terms used where the words may be the same, but the meanings signified by those words are different. And then we learn that paronymous terms are terms which appear to be similar, but are not the same words, and it doesn't matter whether they have the same meanings or not, because they're different cases usually of maybe the same noun or adjective, or maybe different forms of the same verb, but being in different cases, they have to be considered in their own context separately. And what when we studied that, we might wonder, what's the point of this lesson? Why would Aristotle start here? And we see that from the first chapter of his work on categories, the very first book of his Organon, now all the way to the last book, the last work in the series, he's bringing this full circle. And we're going to see that just as we had to watch out for homonymous terms, we also had to watch out for paronymous terms. And now here in this last book, we're going to study the effects of these things and how they lead to false arguments, false conclusions. Okay? Aristotle then says, let us speak, beginning according to nature, from such things as are first. And we may ask, what is he talking about? What does he mean? Let us begin according to nature, from such things as are first. In, I believe it's his Physics, in the opening chapters, he explains the process by which we learn things. And he says, our initial understanding of things is based on the senses. We look at things, we see things as wholes. We see a whole tree, a whole animal, a whole forest. Everything we see through the senses is a whole. And then when we study it, when we investigate it, we analyze it and break it down into its parts. And when we analyze a subject, we find that often the way that it actually exists in its parts, according to its design, according to its true nature, is different than it appears to man and to man's senses. And that's why by reasoning and philosophy, we come to a truer understanding of things than we can by observation, even by scientific observation. Even though scientific observation is a kind of analysis, scientific observation in the modern sense is only an analysis of the physical properties of material things. It can't deal with anything beyond that. That's the shortcoming of modern science. But we move naturally from that which is known as a whole to the senses, to that which is known in part to reason. And that knowledge, according to reason, is considered true wisdom and understanding. That's to know things as God himself knows them, or to know things as they truly exist in nature, rather than as they simply appear to man. So Aristotle says, concerning Sophistical Elenchi, we're going to study in this book, we're going to start from the beginning, according to man's natural process of learning, from such things as are first. He then goes on to say that some things therefore are syllogisms, but that others, though they are not syllogisms, though they are not true arguments, they are not valid arguments, yet they appear to be so, is evident. That some things are syllogisms, true arguments, but that others, though they are not, appear to be so, is evident. And so we see the problem. The problem is not that there are true arguments and false arguments in the world. That's not the problem. The problem is that there are true arguments, and then there are false arguments, but those false arguments appear to be true arguments. And that's what deception is. Deception is being led to believe that what appears to be a syllogism is actually a syllogism or proof. So this is the problem that we're seeking to solve in our study of reasoning in general, but more specifically in this last book of Sophistical Elenchi. Aristotle goes on to say, for as this takes place in other things through a certain similitude or analogy or likeness, so likewise in arguments. And Aristotle is going to say, we can see this reality to be true in different areas of life. We can compare things, and we can see that what's true, and he'll give some examples, what's true of the body physically is also true of arguments and of reasoning. And so he's going to give us a few comparisons or illustrations that can help us understand the problem. So he says, for with respect to the habit of the body, so with respect to the condition of the body, some have their body in a good physical condition. They're truly fit, truly healthy, and in good shape. But others appear to have it, being inflated, he says, on account of the race from which they are descended, and decorate themselves conformably to this inflation. Okay, some have an appearance of health, and some are actually healthy physically. Okay, that's a good comparison, because he's saying reasoning is just like that. There are some people who have an appearance of health, but are not truly healthy. And there are others who have the real thing. The same is true in reasoning. Some are beautiful. Some people are beautiful on account of true beauty. But others appear to be beautiful in consequence of adventitious decoration, or by dress and makeup and whatever else they do to cause themselves to appear beautiful. So when we talk about beauty, what we normally mean is that a certain man or a certain woman are beautiful to look at without the help of any makeup or surgery or any kind of dress or jewelry. They're just naturally beautiful. They don't need to do anything. They're beautiful by nature. And then there are some who can make themselves appear beautiful but are not. And what can be done with makeup and things like this is almost amazing. And Aristotle says, in the same way, men can reason, and you can have true reasoning, which is valid and true and right. And then you can have reasoning that's like an ugly man who's covered with makeup or a mask or disguised to appear beautiful but is actually not beautiful. We can have reasoning that's the same way. He goes on to say this, the like also takes place in inanimate things. We can also see this in the inanimate physical world. And he gives some examples with metals. He says, of metals, some are silver and others are gold in reality. So there is true silver and true gold in the world. But others, though they are not silver and gold, yet appear so to the senses. Thus, substances of the nature of litharge and tin, two different kinds of metals, appear to be silvery. They look like silver, but those which are dyed with gall appear to be golden. And so metals can be manipulated to appear to be something that they're not, or they can be mistaken to be the real valuable metal when in fact they're not. We know, for example, of fool's gold. Okay, fool's gold is a type of metal. I assume it's a metal. I don't think it's a stone, but it has an appearance. It looks like a gold nugget, but it's not actually gold. And there are many people, when there were gold rushes and things like that in the 1800s in American history, were often mistaken by the discovery of what's called fool's gold. It looks like gold. Our senses are telling us that it's gold, but in fact, it's not the real thing. And remember, he's giving us this illustration because reasoning and arguments work in the same way. There are true and valid arguments, and then there are arguments which are not merely false, but appear to be true. That's the danger that we face in listening to the arguments and sayings of other people. We can have people in the world, and we certainly do have people in the world, who appear to be reasonable, but after we've learned the art of reasoning, especially the science that's taught here in this last book on Sophistical Elenchi, we'll be able to see clearly that they appear to be true, but are actually false. Let's keep reading. After the same manner, with respect to syllogism and Elenkus, Elenkus is the singular form, Elenchi is the plural form. With respect to syllogism and Elenkus, one is in reality and another is not, but appears to be on account of unskillfulness. In other words, the reason why a false argument appears to be a true argument is because the listener, the reader, the hearer is unskillful. He doesn't possess the art and science of reasoning, and that's why, to him, a false argument appears to be true. Just as if you were to take fool's gold to an expert, he would easily see that it's not true gold. But a person who's not an expert, who's never actually handled true gold, when he finds the fool's gold, is not able to tell that it's not the real thing. The same is true of people who have not studied the art of reasoning, and especially the science of the Sophistical Elenchi, which we're studying here. And Aristotle explains why. The unskillful contemplate like those who behold objects at a great distance. Remember, this goes back to the natural way in which we learn things. We start off by looking at things as wholes, with our senses, as if from a distance, and we think that we know what they are. But by study, by true contemplation, by philosophical investigation, we zoom in on them, and we analyze them. We break them into their parts, and we study the parts and how those parts come together to form the wholes. But an unskillful person, hearing someone speaking, contemplates like one who beholds something at a great distance. For a syllogism is from certain things so posited that something different from the things posited is necessarily collected through the things posited. And that's the simple description of what a syllogism is. A syllogism starts with two propositions, and these propositions have a certain relationship between them. And if these two propositions are true, some third proposition, called a conclusion, necessarily proceeds from them. And so from two statements, a third necessarily, by reason, proceeds. That's what a syllogism is. A syllogism is from certain things, that is the two premises, so posited that something different from the things posited, that is the conclusion, is necessarily means it must follow by reason, is necessarily collected from or through the things posited, the two things stated. But an Elenkus is a syllogism with a contradiction of the conclusion. And remember, we're not going to try to define Elenkus. We're going to let Aristotle say all that he wants to say about them, and we're just going to collect bits and pieces of information about what an Elenkus is and what a sophistical Elenkus is as we go through this reading. And so here we have our first little bit of information that we need to jot down. He explains what a syllogism is, and then he says, but an Elenkus is a syllogism. So the first thing we know about Elenkus is that it is a kind of syllogism. And then he gives us a little more information here. He says, Elenkus is a syllogism with a contradiction of the conclusion. An Elenkus is a syllogism with a contradiction of the conclusion. And we're going to just leave it there and continue to collect information as we study. So remember, right here he explains for, I don't want to say define because these are not true definitions. He describes for us what a syllogism is and what an elenkus is. And what we've learned is that an elenkus is a kind of syllogism with a contradiction of the conclusion. And we'll look more into that later on in our study. He goes on to say, the unskillful, those who have not studied and mastered the art and science of reasoning, the unskillful do not do this. They do not reason truly. That is, those who are unskillful, and he's not talking about the sophists, because the sophists are skillful. They do this intentionally, and we'll learn about them later. But he's talking about those who are misled by false arguments. He says they don't do this. They don't actually do, or understand even, what the syllogism does, or what the elenkus does. They do not do this, but appear to do it from many causes. That is, there are causes of their false reasoning. There are sources that lead to their false reasoning. There are errors. Remember, these are the unskillful. There are errors in how they think and speak and reason that cause them to draw conclusions that do not actually proceed from the premises. They are not true syllogisms, but they appear to be so because there is some tricky error that's made by the unskillful, and that leads them into all kinds of errors. And that's what we're going to study in this book. The unskillful do not do this, that is, reason rightly, but appear to do it from many causes, one of which is a place most conformable to nature and most popular, namely, through the names of things. And this brings us all the way back, like I said, to the first chapter in Aristotle's Categories. So what he's saying here, one of the causes of this false reasoning, one of the causes, and this is just an introduction, this is just chapter 1. One of the causes of this false reasoning, he says, which is most conformable to nature and most popular, because it's understandable why men would do this, because by nature these things are confusing, and if we don't study them to understand them truly, it's very easy and natural for us to follow them right into all kinds of logical errors. And that's why logical errors are natural to man, because the truth is complicated. And the first source, the most popular and natural source of these logical errors, is in the names of things. Errors that are caused by the names of things. And as I said, this brings us back to the first chapter of the Categories, where he warned us about 3 different ways in which names are used: homonymously, synonymously, and paronymously. And we talked about that when we studied the Categories. Since it is not possible to adduce things by themselves in discourse, but we use names as symbols instead of things, we think that what happens in names also happens in things. So when we speak of things, when we reason, we're not dealing with the things themselves. We're dealing with words that are established by men, by convention, Aristotle taught. And these words, because we have to know the meanings of all of these words, we have to know different meanings, different possible meanings, different senses of these words. This can cause us to misrepresent the things with the words that we use. And then, since our reasoning